So really the right way to think about a lot of these tools is not like, let's do a backwards looking analysis and get to the perfect answer, which is impossible, but rather how do we feed this information into our decision-making system? Help us get an edge in our decision-making, right? It probably won't be perfect. Perfect is impossible, but we can get a little bit better. And if we can use it to get a little bit better, 5% better on a budget of whatever, $1 million, it adds up to a lot of money. We often see this in a problem with media mix modeling in particular.
In our upcoming mini-series, we're focused on MMM, or marketing mix modeling, versus attribution. Are they mortal enemies, best friends who love working together, or somewhere in between? This series asks 3 experts for their thoughts. Welcome to another episode of Attribution Nation. I'm your host, Drew Smith, founder and CEO of Attributa, and I'm joined today by Michael Kaminsky, the founder of Recast, which rids the world of wasted marketing spend. We're going to get more detailed on Michael's background as we dive into the topics. So, Michael, let's get started, particularly in this current mini-series where we're talking about MMM and attribution. These interviews are a lot more nerdy and math-focused than previous interviews and episodes, which, quite frankly, is saying quite a lot. Let's talk a little bit about your background. You come from an economics and analyst background, right? Tell us a little bit about how you get into marketing data and analytics.
Yeah, it's a great question. So my background is definitely on the more academic side. So I was trained as an economist. I really focused on econometrics and microeconometrics in particular. So sort of studying how can we use data and statistics to better understand why people do the things that we do. That's sort of what microeconometrics is all about. I always found that really fascinating. I did work in environmental economics at the very beginning of my career. I studied things like how do people respond to tiered pricing changes in terms of their consumption of water in Phoenix and Tucson, right? That sort of work. From there, I moved into working in the healthcare industry. So I did a lot of work on what's called health economics outcomes research, which is to say really trying to understand things like the burden of disease. How much does it cost when someone has a particular disease to society in terms of medical care, a bunch of different ways of thinking about that. And then also doing, more straightforward analyses of just like treatment A versus treatment B, which one yields better outcomes for which patient subpopulations, clinical trial analysis, that sort of work. So that background is very heavy in econometrics and in particular causal inference, right? How do we make sure that we know that we're getting or do the best that we can to understand what is the causal relationship between some medical treatment intervention and some outcome, as opposed to just a correlation, right? Which is very tricky to do, especially if you're using observational data. And then from there, I moved into sort of more broad-based data science. I started working in startups. I ended up running the data science and analytics team at a company called Harry's. Many listeners are probably familiar with that company/brand.
I'm a customer.
Thank you, Drew. Appreciate that. I still am a stockholder, so I very much value that you are still buying razors.
My pleasure.
I spent a lot of my time there really thinking about marketing analytics. So like other fast-moving consumer goods companies, the relationship between marketing spend and overall profitability is very, very tight. So for that business, even though we had a decent sized data and analytics team, we probably spent about 80% of our time really focused on marketing effectiveness and building tools for marketers to help them make better decisions. So I spent a lot of time really learning about marketing science and then doing some of the analyses that a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with, thinking about things like how do we forecast LTV? How do we predict lifetime value at the customer level? How do we do that efficiently? How do we design experiments that we can run? Geo holdout tests, other types of experiments. All of that work were things that I spent a lot of time thinking about. And then from there, I spent a bunch of time evaluating all of the different types of tools for doing marketing analytics and for understanding incrementality or causality in the world of marketing. And that was what led me into doing media mix modeling, just sort of a specific applied tool for understanding that combined my passion for causal inference, which I've sort of had all of my career, with newfound interest in marketing science, which is a really fascinating and complex field.
Yeah, that's quite a bit. Super interesting, some of the different things that you've done in your background. So you find MMM and you start implementing MMM, and then you ultimately ended up, founding Recast. So how did that come about, and what was kind of like the problem that you saw in the market that you wanted to solve with Recast?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So as I mentioned, I was at Harry's running the data science team. We felt like as a business at the time, there was a need for doing some sort of media mix model to understand the full marketing's impact on the full business, which at that time included distributing through mass retailers like Target and Walmart and grocery and, Walgreens, et cetera, where the touch-based attribution tool that my team had also built and managed, and we were quite proud of, didn't have anything to say. And so we were like, okay, media mix modeling is a thing that we are going to need as a business. I looked at building it in-house. I was like, ooh, this seems really complex. We're going to need to hire a bunch of PhDs if we really want to own this in-house. That's going to be expensive and hard. I talked to a bunch of the vendors that, have been doing MMM for a very long time. This includes businesses like Kantar and Nielsen and Analytic Partners. And I was not really excited about any of the offerings that they had. They were all very expensive, very slow, honestly using outdated statistical methods. And it just didn't feel like the right set of tools for the next generation of marketers that aren't just buying TV at upfronts once a year, but really are trying to dynamically manage a fairly complex marketing mix. And so it felt like there was a gap in the market, and ended up leaving Harry's, ended up starting Recast to really try to address that, to figure out, can we take the idea of a media mix model, which seems important and seems like a good idea, but then rebuild it from the ground up based on more modern statistical methods, and also built to actually really work for the next generation of marketers.
So it's an interesting point that you made about that the need for MMM became more pronounced when you had particular marketing activations, like, for example, selling through displays in Target and Walmart that couldn't be measured through touch-based attribution. I think that's an important distinction to make, because there's a lot of organizations that are trying to get better at marketing analytics. And one of the things that they're doing is they're trying to find, one-size-fits-all solutions that apply to all use cases. When in reality, what you need to do is you need to understand what your use cases are and then identify the best solution to those use cases. If your marketing is 100% trackable by touch-based marketing, cool. Like, you may or may not, I'm not going to say you don't, but you may not need something as complex as MMM. You may be fine with touch-based attribution and things like that. But the moment you start, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I would say the vast majority of businesses do not need something like a media mix model. I mean, again, that's because the long tail of businesses, there's millions of really small businesses and only a few really, really big ones. But those millions of small businesses do not need a media mix model. I often say that media mix modeling it's just really, really, really hard to get right. And honestly, to some extent, it's the worst way of measuring marketing effectiveness, in that it's so complicated, it's so hard to get right. If you can do anything else, you should do that other thing first before turning to media mix modeling, just because it's so hard and it's so easy to get wrong and it's so difficult to use and to use correctly, that do all of the other stuff first. And then only when you have problems that are sufficiently complex and sufficiently big to be worth the investment, and all of the limitations and understanding those limitations that come along with MMM, only at that point should you turn to a media mix model.
I love the transparency here, because this is, most of the time when you talk to an organization that sells something, everybody needs the thing they sell. And here you are, the CEO of an organization selling something, saying, no, not everybody needs what I sell. I love that. I also think you and I agree holistically on this, because I'm an attribution company, right? We don't do attribution. We don't do media mix modeling. There's a reason for that. It's because we're too small. I do all of our marketing and I do all of our selling, so I know where everything's coming from. I don't have complex needs. And there is a maturity process that organizations go through as they scale. their needs become more and more complex. And that's where you need to start adding on the next thing that can help, solve those more complex problems. So I love what you just said about that. So on a lighter note, have you always had the mustache throughout your entire career journey, or is that fairly new here?
It's not new. I've had it for a while. It's been off and on. Let's see. I've had it. I mean, my girlfriend has never seen me without it. I've definitely had it for many years. I shaved it for a little while when I was when I was like freshly single. I was like, okay, I got to go back to clean face look, but then it just ended up coming back. And now I've had it for like over 10 years, I think. So it's been a good long time.
Okay. So you're not just an early adopter of MMM, you're an early adopter of mustaches too. So that's
I don't know. I mean, my father had a mustache as well. So I don't know that I could claim being truly early to it. I think it's just, it's one of those things. There's just always cycles.
Well, true. But in the current cycle of them kind of coming back
in the current cycle, I was definitely. I've always been accused of being a hipster. Whether or not I accept that label is a different question. But people, I was definitely early to the mustache look.
Okay, all right, got it. Is that one of the M's in MMM or no?
We're gonna add a fourth one.
Okay. All right.
So to account for the mustaches.
Okay. Perfect. Excellent. All right. Back to a little bit more serious topics of conversation. So when we're talking to folks about attribution and MMM, it's important to define these things and differentiate these things because they're similar, but not the same. So let's talk about what is your definition of attribution and why does multi-touch attribution exist?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And you will probably balk at this, but I actually prefer to use the term digital tracking instead of attribution, which I think makes it really clear exactly what we're doing, which is trying to track individuals generally across the internet, but across the different marketing touch points that they might engage with, and then assign credit for conversions back to different touch points along that journey. So broadly, digital tracking, attribution, that is what that is all about. The way that you assign credit is sort of, to some extent, where the magic happens, right? Is it a first touch attribution? You credit all of the conversions way to the first marketing touch point. Is it a last touch attribution? You credit all the way to the last touch. Or is it some multi-touch algorithm, which attributes credit evenly across all the different touch points, or, a bathtub shape. So more on the first and more on the last and less in the middle. There's a bunch of different ways you can imagine doing that. But that's how I generally define what attribution or multi-touch attribution or digital tracking is about.
Okay. And so then define MMM. How do you define MMM then?
Yeah. So media mix modeling generally just means top-down statistical. Sorry, we're going to rewind the tape on this. Media mix modeling, or sometimes called marketing mix modeling, is really just a method of doing top-down statistical analysis, linking the relationship between marketing activity and sales. Some people actually just call this econometrics, right? Broadly speaking, we're using econometric methods to understand the relationships between marketing and sales. But really, the defining characteristic is that it's top-down, done on aggregate data. So it's not bottoms-up like a digital tracking or an attribution where you're looking at individuals and those sum up to the total. You're starting with aggregate data. What is the total number of sales last week? And then you're trying to statistically decompose that into the different marketing sources that influence those sales. So that's the main feature of what makes a media mix model.
Okay, so then how are they different?
I mean, it's in almost every way are they different. So let's think a little bit about it. I mean, one of the problems with talking about media mix models in general is that they can be done so differently that it almost it's hard to talk about them in general, because the media mix modeling that happens at Recast is going to look very different from media mix modeling that some other consultants that I've spoken to do. The way that they think about the problem is very different. The problems that they're trying to solve is very different. And so it can be hard to talk about them in general. I think when it comes to digital tracking, some of the benefits that you get, right, is that you do get this individual level attribution. You can say, okay, we know that Steve clicked on an ad prior to purchase because they have these UTM codes. There's interesting things that you can do with that. You can feed that into other machine learning models. You can use that to like customize their experience. There's a bunch of like interesting things that happen there. Media mix models have nothing to say about Steve, right? Steve, like there's no individual level things happening at all. It's really just about aggregates. On average, when we spend more money on Facebook, how much additional revenue do we get? That is the type of question that you are generally using an MMM to answer, as opposed to, what ads did Steve click on or engage with prior to converting? So that's one core difference. Another way to think about the differences here is that attribution or digital tracking is mostly deterministic, which is to say you end up collecting some database of every user and the different touch points that they have. And then there's no, like, when you're calculating first touch attribution or last touch attribution, there's no uncertainty with that. It's like, what ad did Steve click on first or what ad did Steve click on last? And that's it. You're done. Econometric methods like an MMM have statistical uncertainty built into them. They are sort of, again, what a statistician would call a stochastic process, which is to say there's like randomness in the system. There's going to be uncertainty in the estimates that are coming out of that system. And so you often get a result out of your MMM, which is, on average, when we spend $1,000 on meta prospecting, we get $5,000 in revenue or 45 conversions, plus or minus some number, right? Which is to say that there's uncertainty, right? It could be a range. It could be anywhere from X to Y. All of those results are compatible with the data. And that is, again, it's very different than the sort of deterministic process that comes with doing attribution or digital tracking. Again, this isn't like an insane thing to hear. If you've looked at the results of a clinical trial, those also have uncertainty, right? On average, when we give this treatment to patient X, their recovery time shortens from X to Y with uncertainty, right? All of this is built in. There's a lot of methods for understanding this, but that's what you get with these sort of top-down econometric methods is uncertainty. And so that's very much a core part of understanding how media mix models work and can be disconcerting for people who come from only having worked with attribution touch-based models where there is like a deterministic answer where it's like, yes, Steve touched on, clicked on this and clicked on that, and there's no like uncertainty there. The last thing I think to think about is the different approaches to causality or incrementality. So I often say that like incrementality is the thing that marketers should really care about, right? What's the causal relationship between the marketing activity that we're doing and the business results that we're getting on the other side? One disadvantage of like a touch-based attribution approach is that there's not even the idea of a counterfactual, right? We don't have very many good ways of saying, well, what would have happened if Steve hadn't seen that ad or hadn't clicked on that ad, right? We don't really know. You can do like some multi-touch attribution providers like claim that they're doing this synthetic control thing. I'm often skeptical of some of those approaches. We can talk a little bit about why later on, but that ends up being really hard. Whereas the MMM approach, at least if done correctly, in my opinion, should really be focused on estimating causal relationships and getting this true idea of incrementality, and the idea of the counterfactual should be built into the structure of the model itself. And so can give you better causal estimates, at least in some cases, than something like an attribution or a touch-based model.
Okay, this is awesome. So I think one of the ways that I think that you and I would agree on the difference between attribution and MMM is I've always viewed attribution as like and the analogy that I always use is attribution allows you to go zoom in and look at every single tree in the forest, every single individual tree, and even every leaf on every tree. And you can zoom out and see the forest, and that's cool. With MMM, it's really like if you put a telescope on the moon looking back to see all the forests, that's like the level of like zoom in, zoom out that you get with the two types of technology.
I think I would broadly agree that the one asterisk that I would put on your description is that in touch-based attribution, there's trees that are missing and you don't know that they're missing. And that's, I think, one of the key things that I would call out, which is that we don't necessarily see all of the touches, right? For example, there's cross-device linking. How often is that happening? Are we missing things? What do you do with a billboard or linear television where, the matchback is hard? Even things like streaming TV, weird things start to happen there. And for the trees that are there, yes, you can see them, but there's some that are missing, that are invisible somehow. And so that's the one thing that I always like to make sure that we emphasize when we're talking about touch-based attribution, is that sometimes we're missing touches that really were there but aren't tracked or aren't trackable for some reason. And it's important to keep that in mind when we're looking at those results.
Totally. Yeah, there's certain things that touch-based attribution just cannot track. Like billboards are a great example. There's nothing you can do there because almost zero people see a billboard and then will go type in the vanity URL that somebody put on the billboard so that you could build a touch-based attribution model around it. So it's just not going to happen. So I would agree with you on that. The other thing that I think is super important for organizations to remember as well with the differences here is that with touch-based attribution, we always advise our clients to not use the word cause in any way, shape, or form when you're talking about attribution, touch-based attribution. We are not trying to understand what caused something to happen. We are trying to understand what was the journey that this opportunity took from before the opportunity was even created, back when the lead was created, all the way up into when the opportunity was closed. What was the journey that happened there? And how does that relate to other opportunities? Did they take similar journeys? Did they not take similar journeys? And what are the commonalities that we can find? That's how we always recommend our customers think about touch-based attribution, and get the word caused out of your mouth entirely. Don't use it ever.
I applaud it. The problem is that human psychology is so oriented towards cause and effect and linking things that it's very hard. Even if you aren't using the word cause, people look at the report and they're like, oh yeah, Facebook is causing more conversions. That is just immediately where their mind goes, because we're so again, many, many thousands of years of evolution have just made us that way to look for the cause and the effect in things. It's what has made us, very successful as a species. But in certain situations, and touch-based attribution is one of them, it can end up leading you astray.
Totally agree. Absolutely. Now, for you and some of the orgs that you work with, my assumption here, and I'm gonna allow you to correct my assumption, is that you primarily work with larger teams that have analysts, and they might have a PhD in there. Is there a size of team or organization or a sophistication level that an organization needs to be at in order for MMM to either make sense or not make sense?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, so you're right, most of our customers have analytics teams. Some of them have marketing analytics team of 12 people that's separate from a 70-person data science team. They're really big orgs. So most of our customers look more like that. We do have some customers that are, a lot smaller and more lean. The question that you're asking, I think, is the right one though, which is how sophisticated does the org need to be? And with the small orgs that we work with, they maybe have one analyst or no analyst, but the CMO is worked at McKinsey for 15 years, super analytical, really data driven, and just gets it. And so that's ends up being okay. The problem that we see is when you have, the really small team, no analyst support, and the marketing leadership is not super numerate or isn't, doesn't have this background in statistics and data analysts and data analysis. And that can be a real challenge. So let's sort of ask ourselves, why is that the case? And I think I alluded to it earlier when I talked about some of the limitations, or at least the differences between media mix modeling and touch-based attribution. And one of them is, again, the stochastic nature, or the idea of uncertainty. We are doing a statistical analysis where there is uncertainty. Uncertainty is very unnatural. This, again, is sort of again, the evolution has gone the opposite direction here, where people want to see cause and effect. Nate Silver has written a ton about this. So Nate Silver is the election forecaster. Many people at least in the data world, are familiar with his work.
538, right?
538. Yeah. He started 538. Anyways, did these like election forecasts, and they would often do these election forecasts, which would be like, Hillary Clinton has a 2 out of 3 chance of winning the election. And people look at that and they're like, oh yeah, Hillary Clinton is going to win. But Nate would have to be like, no. That's not what that means. That means that like you flip a coin 3 times and it comes up heads twice and like she loses. And like you can easily imagine that happening. But people see 2/3 chance and they're like, oh yeah, slam dunk. It's more than 50%, so she's going to win. Same thing happens with the interpretation of results coming out of an MMM, right? You see this result and you're like, okay, well, the midpoint of the estimate is an ROI of 3.5x. And people are like, okay, great. Like the channel's good. It's incremental. But it's like, but actually you look at you sort of dig one level deeper and it's like, oh, well, the range is actually between 1 and 5x. And so like, it could be good. It could be great. It could be bad. And like, you need to know what to do with that and how to make a decision in the face of uncertainty. And that, again, can be really challenging for people who do not have the statistics or the analytics background to try to think about like, oh man, there's uncertainty. What do I do with it? And so often having like a data science team on board that's like can help interpret the results and share them out with the rest of the organization and make sure that everyone understands can be really, really helpful. Whereas if you're just a marketer and you don't have as much of this background, like getting into this on your own can be really daunting because of how non-intuitive a lot of statistical results are. And just to be clear, this is not, like just a problem with MMM. Even running experiments, like we have, we talk to a lot of organizations that run geo-lift experiments. And that's great, but like often, people misinterpret the results because they don't take into account the uncertainty that's coming out with that estimate. They'll be like, oh yeah, we worked with this vendor and they said that, the channel had incremental lift. And I'm like, that doesn't tell you anything. Like we assume that all marketing is positive to some degree, right? It's not negatively impacting you. So just saying that it has incremental lift doesn't actually really help us. What matters is what is the range of cost per conversion coming out of this experiment. And often you double click and you open up the hood and you're like, okay, great. So like you had an incremental CPA of $40, but that ranges between $5 and $1,000 once you actually look at the uncertainty associated with that result. And that again can be like, well, what do we do with that? And there are things you can do with that. That is information that you can use in decision making, but it's not, necessarily like a slam dunk, something really easy for someone who doesn't have a background in statistics to be able to say like, oh yeah, it's really obvious what we should do with this now.
So how do you, so this is an interesting thing because we run into some of these conversations as well with organizations that have some uncertainty in like their touch-based attribution. Because like, we have a touch point that was missed because somebody didn't opt into cookies. And it's like, okay, one touch point out of 1,000 is irrelevant. So, and we have our talk track to explain that. So how do you deal with helping organizations understand that uncertainty doesn't mean that data is bad, or one missing touch does not mean that the data is bad? How do you help build that confidence in a world where perfection is not achievable and there is always going to be uncertainty in any data model that you have?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. What we try to focus on is what are the actions that you need to take. And that is the right way to break the deadlock around uncertainty. We often see this in a problem with media mix modeling in particular. Is there's this like analysis paralysis. And, if the model isn't perfect, we can't do anything. And that's just like it's not actually right. You can do a lot of things. What you need to do is take into account that uncertainty as you're making decisions, but you can totally do that. And you can say, hey, look, we're really uncertain about this channel, but it has a chance of being a big winner. So let's double down on it for the next 2 months. And that will give us a bunch of signal as to like, is it a big winner or not? And then after that, we can make another decision and take some amount of action. And so really the right way to think about a lot of these tools is not like, let's do a backwards looking analysis and get to the perfect answer, which is impossible, but rather how do we feed this information into our decision-making system? Use us to help us get an edge in our decision-making, right? It probably won't be perfect. Perfect is impossible, but we can get a little bit better. And if we can use it to get a little bit better, 5% better on a budget of whatever, $1 million, it adds up to a lot of money. It starts adding up to like real benefits for the business if you can get 5% better every quarter, right? And so that's generally what we're focused on is how do we use this to make decisions? How can we, help gain more certainty through action as opposed to a lot of like the navel gazing analysis paralysis problems that can come up when you're too focused on, can we get to the perfect model, which is impossible.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really important conversation for marketers. They're trying to get buy-in for any kind of advanced data system, whether it's touch-based attribution or MMM, because there's such a fear in the marketing world about, well, what if the data is wrong and we make the wrong decision? Well, you cannot. It is impossible to take the uncertainty completely out of it. And I will tell you right now that any platform that tells you that we can tell you exactly what to do with your budget with zero uncertainty and we have 100% accuracy, they're lying to you because it's not possible. It's not possible. So marketers have to understand that there's always going to be some level of uncertainty that we have to be able to live with when we're doing data modeling and advanced data processes. You're never going to get to 100% data accuracy. You're never going to get to 100% accuracy with a model. So we have to understand what the potential inaccuracies are and be able to, good enough in this case is good enough, right? Because you're never going to get perfect.
I think so. Yeah, 100% agree. I think it could be helpful to like sometimes think about like the hedge fund analogy, right? Hedge funds are very, very, very happy if they can get to some algorithm that is, correct 51% of the time, right? If they can just get a little tiny amount of edge, 50.5%, right? They win. They're going to lose a whole ton. Doesn't matter because they can get that edge and they can scale up that edge and make a ton of money. And I think marketers are often working in that same world where it's like, hey, look, we're not going to be 100% accurate. The only way for that to happen is to spend no dollars, right? Is to like totally shut the budget off. That's the only way to avoid wasting. But we can always get a little bit better. And if we can get edge, we can continue to grow and continue to reinvest. And that's actually the thing that you should be looking for is how can we identify edge? How can we get a little bit better? Use that to make better decisions, use that to make more money for the business, and then keep that ball rolling.
Yeah, I think it's important I love what you're saying about edge, because I think it's important for orgs to remember that the edge you're trying to get is one, against yourself previously, what you were previously able to do, and number two, against your competitors. Because if your competitors are not doing this, and you can get a model that's accurate 51% of the time, you have an edge on your competitors because they have a model that's accurate 0% of the time because they're not doing anything and they're measuring marketing based off of vibes. And when you get to a certain level of scale, vibes don't cut it. They just don't. So I think it's important for marketers to understand about this edge concept. I love that. So you also advocate for marketing teams to, and I'm going to use some quotation fingers here, dynamically manage marketing through ongoing experimentation. And that got me thinking, if you could build like a perfect marketing team, how would they operate? How would they manage their budget? And like, what types of roles would there be?
It's a really good question. I think the thing that I'm going to describe is actually in large part going to sound like very appealing to marketers. And some marketers think like, oh man, this economics nerd wants to come in and, perfectly optimize, but I'm the expert. And that's actually not the case. I actually really think that many businesses would do better by unleashing their marketers more, and in particular, encouraging them to take big swings. Right now, I think a lot of marketers and marketing teams broadly spend too much time on these little minor optimizations that aren't actually helping to unlock new avenues for the business. So I think, ideal marketing teams, you have great creative people. I think marketing only works when the creative is really, really good. I am not that person that is good at creating really good creative. There are people who are very good at it. You need to get those people and you need to unleash them. Because again, if you have bad creative, sure, you can try to like do some tweaks to optimize meta or whatever with the bids, but like really you should be focused on getting really good creative that resonates with your ideal consumer. That's going to unlock way more value than almost anything else that you can do. And then the second thing, and I don't know who the right person to hire to do this is, but I would try to really open up budget for big swings and experiments, right? How are we going to test out that new creative? How are we going to test out new strategies? How are we going to take budget and allocate it into these swings, whether it's trying out new channels, trying out new things? I would put a lot of emphasis on, being intellectually honest in terms of the ROI of those swings. I think that's the only way that it works, right? Because you don't want people trying to win awards with their ads, right? That can be, I think, a real problem with some marketing teams, is they're like, oh, great, I get to take a big swing. I'm going to try to win an award at Cannes. And like, that's not what you want. You want people who are taking big swings in the interest of driving the business forward. So you need someone, whether it's an analyst or a data scientist or whoever, who can really help those marketers understand where the swing worked and where it didn't, and be intellectually honest with the organization. We took these 4 swings, all of them were misses. Like, that is okay. Like if they're big swings and they're all misses, fine, because maybe the 6th one is actually going to unlock 10x growth for the business. And I think those are the things that you really want to be thinking about as a marketing team, is how can we unlock those big step change pieces of growth. And the only way that you can do that is with experimentation and taking big swings and being intellectually honest about where they work and where they don't. So that's like key point 1, and really like communicating that out to the organization, right? A lot of these organizations are just so fear-based, where they're like, oh man, if the experiment doesn't work, we totally failed and I'm going to get fired. And so like, you really need to build a culture where that's not true, where people can take these swings and try things, and a lot of them won't work, but some of them will. And so I think when I imagine like a really high functioning marketing team, that's really what it looks like.
I love everything you said there, because so first off, we, our first miniseries, we talked to C-level folks at like the marketing attribution companies like Marketo Measure, Aaron Bird, the founder of Visible, CEO of Caliber Mind, and so on. And every single one of them said that you should have like an R&D budget for marketing, where you just get to experiment and do crazy shit and see what happens. So like you're thinking along the same lines, and I think we would support that as well. I think the other thing, and this leads me into a question I've been asked right after this, is how you talked about good creative. Good creative is so tough to judge because it comes from art, right? And art is always subjective, right? So how, as a data guy, how do you incorporate like the art side of marketing into like metrics and analysis? Because obviously, if you have 2 pieces of creative and one sucks from a creative standpoint, the other one is amazing from a creative standpoint, they're going to perform very differently. So how do you figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the place where I think, anytime that a company gets into the business of trying to like guess which creative is better, like ends up failing. Marketers tend to love creative that like resonates with them in a very intellectual way. And that creative often is not the best creative in terms of driving sales or getting consumers to take some action or even have like positive brand affinity. All of those things. Often you just need to get it out in the water and get it in front of humans. And so the way that I think about it is we need to build a system that gives those creatives the feedback on what is working in the market. And again, for some creatives that might be disappointing because they want to like do the really aspirational thing that, is art to them, but that doesn't resonate with the market. You need to keep those creatives and those marketers really oriented around some quantifiable metric that gives them the feedback that they need to do what is right for the business. But so again, I think about what are those systems, right? You can imagine A/B testing systems, right? This is now like, every marketing platform has this built in, but that's great, right? Like which of these is driving more conversions or more higher click-through rate or whatever. That stuff is totally great. And I think that's the right system to have, is unleash the creatives, let them try wild things, but judge them on quantitative aspects and give them that feedback so that way they know, hey, here are the types of things that are really working and resonating with our audience, and the other stuff isn't. And that I think is the right thing to do. Don't box them in with like all of these guidelines of like, oh, it has to look like this and have this thing. Like let them spread their wings a little bit, but give them the feedback from the data. And that is what will ideally keep them focused on the stuff that's really driving the business forward.
Okay. Yeah. I'm a huge proponent of A/B testing. And I think that one of the things that A/B testing gives people a little bit of freedom to do is to get more creative. Because if we're doing testing, you can have one that's a little bit more, blah, right? And then you get to test it against the super creative one and see which one works better. And it eliminates, when you focus on testing, it eliminates that culture of fear where if something fails, I'm going to get fired, because we're operating in an environment where failure is expected because we are testing things, right? And that fear of failing and getting fired just stifles creativity.
100%. And I agree. And this is out. And again, I think that should be true outside of just like specific creative A versus creative B, but like a whole channel, right? Does Snapchat work for us? If the answer is no, that's fine. No one should get fired. We did a good effort. We ran a good test. We learned a bunch of stuff. That's great. You need to build a culture where that's totally acceptable, even for these like bigger swings outside of like blue background versus red background. Like,
yeah.
At the whole strategy level, you need to be thinking about how can we build these experiments and accepting, non-positive results from the experiments into the culture.
Yeah, I think the other thing that goes along with that is, you talked about intellectual honesty. And I think that when folks operate with intellectual honesty, it also kind of helps open up that ability to experiment and test, because that as the person that's going to be, receiving the results of that test and making decisions about, well, what should we continue doing? What should we stop doing? That nobody's blowing smoke up your ass and just saying that this worked really well because they're afraid of losing their job. So creating a culture of intellectual honesty, I think, is super important. I agree with that wholeheartedly. So we did a little stalking on your LinkedIn, and we found a post that you talked about where you referenced the inaction and pain cycle in marketing measurement. Can you explain that concept for listeners here? Because I found this post to be extremely interesting.
Yeah. So the inaction and pain cycle is sort of the way that we talk about marketing teams getting into this like really sad failure mode, where, one way to think about it is that they're trying to do too much local optimization, right? They have some measurement system that only works for certain channels, right? Maybe, they can measure their Facebook and their Google spend really well, or, again, I don't even know if it's measured well, but like they get clear signal there, and everything else, can't really be measured. And so they can't take action and try it. And then, their results are sort of getting worse over time, but they can't do anything because they can't measure it. And it's sort of this like downward spiral. And there's a bunch of different flavors of it, but that's like roughly the idea. And this is a thing, you can get into it with like the analysis paralysis that I've talked about before, where it's like, oh man, if we don't have the perfect measurement, we can't do anything. And then it's like stuff gets worse and worse and worse over time. That's one flavor of it as well. And I think that this is a trap that a lot of marketing teams fall into. And I think it's really important for marketing teams to break out of that trap, right? Because especially in the world that we're in today, where over the last 5 or 10 years, like you could do a lot of digital tracking and build really big businesses just by advertising on Facebook and Google. And now the world looks different than that. I mean, I know that you sort of focus more on B2B, Drew, which is a little bit less true, but like in the consumer world, like there was a long time where you could build a really big business just by like dumping money into Facebook and Google, but that's no longer true for a bunch of different market related reasons, not true anymore. And so there's a bunch of teams that I talked to that like built these really big businesses. Now they're like shrinking and they don't know what to do. And they're like, we can't do anything on any other marketing channel because we can't measure it. And now everyone's frustrated. And that's a real bummer. And so you have to find some way to break out of that, whether that's by introducing new measurement methods, accepting that there are some things that you can't measure, taking this big swing approach, which is, again, is very different than like the micro optimizations that your team might be used to doing just via Facebook and Google platforms. And so those are the things that need to change to be able to break out of that cycle and continue growing as a business now that the landscape of marketing and, business performance has really changed over the last couple of years.
Okay, awesome. I love that. I think that, I think that one of the biggest things here is just having the ability to take big swings and experiment and try different things. I love that. One of the principles of Recast is transparency, which I'm a huge fan of. As part of that, you've provided some questions that people should be using and asking when they're exploring MMM vendors. So let's talk about a little bit about that and help us understand what good or great answers would sound like versus not good or great answers. Help people understand what to look for when selecting an MMM vendor. So first one is like, how can we validate the model's results?
This is, I think, the most important question. And, I often say that like when you're evaluating an MMM vendor or approach, internal, external, whatever, like the first 9 out of 10 questions that you ask should all be about validation, because it's very easy to run an MMM model. You can do it in Excel, very easy to do, trivial, very hard to get correct results out on the other side. And this is the problem with media mix models. This is why it's so difficult, is because it's really easy to get numbers. Anyone can get numbers. The problem is doing it in a way that's like actually valid. And there are millions and millions and millions of different MMMs that you could run that will all give you wrong results. They will mislead your business. They will cause you to spend money in the wrong channels and waste those dollars. And there's really only one that's actually going to be right. And so how do you know if you have the one or if you have any of the other million options? So this is a critically important question. Good answers will involve validating the MMM results outside of the model. This is critically important. Anything that is internal to the model is not a good way of validating the model itself. You cannot validate the model with internal to the model metrics. And so if people talk about like R squared or even any in-sample measure of goodness of fit, sometimes people will say like root mean squared error or MAPE or these other things. Those are all terrible, right? Because they're all internal to the model itself and therefore cannot validate the model at all. So that's the first thing to keep an eye out for, is you want the vendor to be thinking about how do we validate this model outside of the modeling framework, because that is what is actually going to give us confidence that we, aren't in one of the million bad models, but actually have a good one. Because all of those million bad models will all have very good R squared and very good MAPE internal to the model itself. So that's important to know. The things that we generally like to talk about as ways to validate the model are a couple of different things. So one way is with out of sample predictive accuracy. So you look at how well does the model do at forecasting data that it has never seen before. So like chop off the last month, train the model through 30 days ago, ask that model predict the next 30 days. That's a really good way to start thinking about evaluating the model outside of the model itself. When you're evaluating vendors, this is a thing that we often encourage people to do. Just chop off that last month. Don't even send it to them. Don't share it with them at all. Ask them to make the prediction and compare with the actuals yourself. That's a great practice.
Oh, that one's good. I like that. That's good stuff.
It's a good thing to do. A lot of vendors will just totally fail it. So like, again, I think it's really, really important to do. Other things to do is to corroborate with other types of experimental results. And so this could be like a go dark test. Like, hey, last month we went dark on branded search. Here's what the implications of that were, or geo lift tests, or even conversion lift studies done with partners like Meta or Google. Those are all really good ways to measure incrementality. They have their own limitations, but they're a great way. If your results from your MMM don't match the experimental results, I generally trust the experimental results more, right? So I would say probably, not 100% of the time, probably the problem is with the MMM. And so that's where I look first. And then the last thing to do, and again, this goes back to this idea of like continued iteration and experimentation. You should be able to look at the MMM's results. It will say some channels performing well and other ones aren't. You should be able to do something with that and see how that impacts your revenue or conversions. You should be able to say, look, if the MMM is right and we pull money out of this channel, then we should see conversions barely dip at all. So let's do it next month. Let's go experiment. Let's see if the MMM is right. Do conversions dip? If they dip, oops, MMM isn't right. We need to put the channel back on and then, really ask some hard questions to the vendor. Those are the things that you want to be doing. And I think the really good vendors bring that process, that's part of their process. They expect that, they encourage that, they want you to be doing that because they know how hard this is and they want to be, sort of pinning in the model and saying, can we validate that this is actually working or not? So those are the sorts of things that I would be looking for when it comes to asking a vendor this question is how are we going to validate these results? How are we going to know that this thing is actually...
Okay, that's awesome. I think that one of chopping off the last 30 days is brilliant because then you can just see like, well, how good was it? And compared to actual results, that's fantastic. So, Michael, we're coming up on time here. Tell me about Recast. You founded it. Tell me about the tool. Who's it right for? Who should be calling you tomorrow after they listen to this?
Yeah. So again, we're in the media mix modeling space. Broadly, we do a lot of incrementality. So if you're thinking about incrementality, definitely check out our website. Again, the software might not be perfect for everyone, but we have a lot of amazing resources at getrecast.com. So I would encourage everyone who's interested in this topic to go check that out. Broadly, we tend to work with businesses that are consumer focused, right? So they're advertising to end consumers that are spending at least $10 million a year on paid media. There are variations to that, right? So it's like we work with some, prosumer apps or some like really scaled B2B businesses that advertise to a lot of SMBs. But roughly consumer type businesses spending $10 million plus on paid media. If that's you and you're feeling this pinch of, our board's asking us for a forecast next year and we have no idea where to start, it's probably worth a reach out. So I would encourage any marketers or data scientists in that world to give us a shout.
Awesome. All right. Well, I hope you get some calls. I really do. We always like to close these out with some key takeaways that I heard during this. So a couple of the key takeaways that I think is relevant for listeners here. Number one, uncertainty is baked into MMM versus the deterministic process of attribution. So with attribution, you really don't know what the uncertainty is. With MMM, it's baked in. And really the way to kind of be a little bit more comfortable with that is to focus on the decision-making process. So making decisions is the most important thing because interpreting the data is more complex than people instinctively think it is. The whole analogy that you said of like, well, Hillary's, has a 2/3 chance to win the election. Well, yeah, I mean, everybody thinks that that's like just locked in, but it's really not. Also, thinking about your marketing budget like a hedge fund manager, if you can find that little tiny edge over what you were doing previously or your competitors, you're gonna win. You're gonna win over yourself previously and over your competitors. Human psychology messes us up so much because we just want to look at cause and effect and we just want to say this caused that, when in reality, sometimes we can't. Also, another one is that there's a lot of complexities that sometimes can cause some issues with touch-based attribution, particularly those types of things that can't be tracked, like we talked about billboards and things like that. So the more you know about what's being tracked and what you know and what isn't being tracked or what can't be tracked, it'll help you if you're using touch-based attribution. It'll help you focus on the right things. Ultimately, one of the things I loved the most was marketing teams should be investing in big swings. It's great to make, incremental improvements, 1% here, 2% there, but marketers need to be looking for big swings and they need to be building an environment where they can experiment and test new ideas and see what wins and what doesn't win. And we have to be intellectually honest when we discuss what's working and what's not working. And we also need to build a culture that makes it safe to fail, because you're never going to have those big swings that win if you don't have a big swing that fails. You're not. And then the last one here is when you're validating a model, it's super important to look outside the model. You cannot look inside the model to validate a model. But a couple of the techniques that you mentioned are chopping off the last 30 days of the model and seeing, did the model predict what actually happened in those 30 days? And then also, when you see that the model is recommending X, go try X. See what happens. If the model's working well, X will work well as well. So those are the big takeaways here. Michael, thank you so much for joining the podcast. Really enjoyed the conversation. I love nerding out about numbers and data, particularly with people that are smarter than me in that area and that I can learn from. So thank you for sharing your thoughts here today.
Drew, thank you so much for having me. I don't know about smarter than you. I learned a lot as well. Great conversation. This was really fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it. On our next episode and the final episode in this mini-series, my producer Andrea and I will be talking through our biggest takeaways from all the episodes, everything we hope to learn, We hope to see you there.